the silence of the woods, something waits, and it knows your name. Tonight, dread Scribe writes again. When the call came in, it sounded ordinary enough. A hiker overdue, last seen near the backcountry ridgeline of Yellowstone. Missing. Hikers were not rare, but something in the dispatcher's tone hinted at unease. I strapped on my pack, grabbed my radio, and headed toward the coordinates. The trail leading up was supposed to be well-traveled, beaten into soil by boots and mule hooves. Yet when I arrived, it was as if the earth itself had pulled a blanket tight across its skin. No scuff marks, no bent grass, no indentation of rubber soles. Just smooth dirt, untouched, like the world had decided to erase him. I crouched and brushed my hand across the ground. The soil was cold, colder than it should have been under the afternoon sun. It felt slick, almost oily, and when I rubbed my fingers together, a metallic scent clung to them. It reminded me of rust, or worse, the tang of iron-rich blood drying on steel. My stomach nodded. Science says iron in the soil comes from centuries of geological shifts, from bedrock and groundwater, leaching through layers of time. But standing there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground had bled. The ridgeline loomed ahead, teeth of stone cutting against the pale sky. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, as though the sun had fallen out of rhythm. Normally dusk. In Yellowstone is a gentle collapse, the orange fading to violet in a slow, patient surrender. That evening it felt hurried, distorted, like a lantern dimming too quickly. The trees seemed taller, leaning toward me with spindly insistence. Every step forward pressed me deeper into an atmosphere that was both suffocating and hollow. I tried to follow the logic of my training. Missing hikers wander off trails. Panic makes them double back. Hypothermia strips reason. But what I saw refused those explanations. The footprints simply stopped mid-stride. The last print was clear, deep, and then nothing. As if the hiker had walked off the page of the world. I had seen avalanches bury tracks, winds erase sand, snow swallow signs of life. But the soil here was undisturbed, unbroken, like a sheet of glass with no ripple. My radio hissed at my hip. Static flared, sharp and stinging. I lifted it to my ear, expecting dispatch, but the voice that came through was not one I recognized. It was low, distorted, stretched thin as if dragged through metal. And it said my name. Not once, but twice. Drawn out, syllables breaking like brittle bones. I froze, my mouth dry, my pulse pounding in my throat. I checked the channel, adjusted frequencies, but the airwaves were clean, too clean. I stood there, caught between the rational part of my mind and the primal fear crawling up my spine. Science teaches that radio signals bounce, distort, catch fragments of words from truckers, tourists, or even atmospheric anomalies. But this wasn't a fragment. It was intimate, directed. Whoever, or whatever, spoke knew me. The forest had gone quiet. No crickets, no distant wolves, not even the sigh of wind through the lodge poles. Silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water, crushing, immense. The longer I stood, the more it felt alive, as though the silence itself was listening. I forced myself to take another step, then another, each footfall louder than it should have been. My boots sounded foreign, like echoes in a cavern, though I was standing in open air, and then the ground trembled, just faintly, like a chest exhaling. A breath from below. I froze, staring at the trail ahead, wondering not where it would take me, but if it would let me return. That night, I set up camp near the ridge, though every instinct told me not to linger. My fire crackled with reluctant sparks, each one sputtering out as if the air itself didn't want light. I brewed coffee in my battered tin cup, clinging to routine like a lifeline. The warmth steadied my hands, but my eyes kept flicking toward the trail, half expecting to see the missing hiker stumble back through the trees. Instead, the darkness thickened, folds of shadow layered over one another like ink spreading across paper. I opened my field notebook, hoping the act of writing would anchor me. I jotted details, coordinates, soil composition, light conditions. Facts are supposed to build barriers against fear, yet the ink wavered under my hand, as if my words resisted permanence. I remembered something a geologist once told me. Yellowstone is alive beneath its surface. Geysers, magma chambers, tectonic shifts. It is a restless landscape, always moving, always reshaping. But what if its appetite wasn't just geological? What if the land didn't just shift, but claimed? The radio crackled again. Static flared and died, then returned with a steady pulse, almost like a heartbeat. I lifted it to my ear, bracing. This time the voice was fainter, as though carried on a wind that didn't exist. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered. 3 words, brittle and cold. My own reflection stared back at me from the dark glass of the device, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if the voice came from outside or from within. My fire dipped low, shadows rising taller than the flames. They warped against the canvas of my tent, elongated figures bending in grotesque mimicry of human form. I rubbed my eyes, blaming fatigue. But when I looked again, the shapes hadn't disappeared. They moved with intention, sliding closer until they pressed against the fabric. My breath came fast, each inhale scraping my lungs like gravel. I reached for my flashlight, snapped it on, and swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing, just trees, just night. But the outlines had left faint impressions, as though burned into memory. I barely slept. Every rustle became a warning. Every gust of wind, a whisper. Dawn arrived gray and heavy, sunlight filtered through a sky veiled in ash-colored clouds. I packed quickly, eager to abandon the ridge. But before leaving, I forced myself back onto the vanishing trail. The soil was different now, darker, wetter, as though something had seeped upward in the night. And in the middle of the path, pressed deep into the mud, was a single footprint, not the hiker's, larger, bare, toes splayed wide like the grasp of a hand. I crouched, pulse hammering. The print pulsed faintly with moisture, fresh, impossibly so. I touched the edge with my fingertips, and the metallic tang returned, sharper than before, as if the ground was bleeding beneath my skin. My radio hissed again, softer this time, but no words followed. Only breathing, not mine. I stood, spine rigid, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that I was no longer alone. Some trails, I realized, aren't meant to be found. Some are meant to find you. And as I turned to leave, I saw it. A second footprint, deeper than the first, pressed into the earth. The cave has a weight that clings to the skin. It isn't just damp, it feels almost intelligent, like the cave itself is breathing against you. I had led tours here for years, memorizing the twists of the passages, the way sound ricocheted like marbles on stone. To tourists, I explained acoustics as though it were a magic trick. Clap once, and the cavern answers in layers. But when the crowd left and silence swallowed the chambers, the cave no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a listener. I stayed. Late that evening, flashlight in hand, recording equipment strapped to my belt. The Park Service had asked me to note any unusual formations along the lower routes. Alone, the echo of my own footsteps was exaggerated, bouncing back to me sharper than expected, like the cave wanted me to know I was intruding. Droplets of condensation slipped from the ceiling, falling with a rhythm that mimicked a ticking clock. It gave the illusion that time was moving differently, that the longer I stayed, the more the surface world drifted away. Halfway down a narrow throat of limestone, I tested the acoustics with a single word. My own name. My voice traveled into the black, stretching into syllables I barely recognized. The expected response came a moment later, a warped version of me, fractured by rock. But then came another. A second return, delayed and softer, carrying a texture that wasn't mine. It whispered my name like it had been practicing, like the walls themselves had learned how to shape the sound. I froze, beam of light quivering against the rock. Limestone carries sound in unpredictable ways, I told myself. Pockets, angles, reflections. They warp voice into illusions. But this wasn't just a reflection. It was too precise, too intentional. My heart rattled against. My ribs each beat loud in the stillness like a drum calling predators. I whispered again, testing the air. This time, the reply came faster, as though waiting for me. The flashlight beam revealed moisture slicking the walls like sweat. Stalactites gleamed with wet sheen, dripping in intervals that felt almost synchronized with my breaths. The cave seemed alive, its geology masquerading as flesh. My throat tightened with the recognition that deep time was pressing in on me. These rocks had heard countless voices before mine, each echo preserved like fossils in sound. Could it be that the cave was simply remembering? But what I heard next tore logic away. The whisper didn't just echo my name, it added words, a string of syllables no language could claim, strung together like broken glass. My spine went rigid, my mind straining to interpret. Was it geological resonance? Infrasound vibrating beyond human hearing? Or was it something older, a voice not of human origin carved by the cave's darkness? The silence afterward was unbearable. It didn't feel empty. It felt watchful, like eyes had opened in the stone. My hand shook as I adjusted the flashlight, sweeping it across shadows that swayed without movement. And then, in the corner of the chamber, the beam caught something pale pressed against the rock. Not stone, not shadow, a shape leaning forward, waiting. The cave didn't just echo anymore. It was answering. The shape vanished as quickly as my light struck it, retreating into darkness with a speed that didn't belong to stone. My breath fogged in the damp air, but the cave's temperature hadn't changed. That detail unsettled me more than anything. The fog was mine, yet it felt borrowed, as though the cave had exhaled through me. I steadied myself, forcing logic back into my chest. Human figures in caves are tricks of the eye. Stalactites, shadows, pareidolia. But tricks don't whisper your name. I pushed deeper, the tunnel tightening like the throat of a beast. My flashlight beam was my only tether to sanity, cutting narrow ribbons of visibility. Every time I spoke aloud, I prayed for silence, yet the cave never granted it. My words came back altered, stripped of humanity. It wasn't just the distortion of rock, it was mimicry. Like a child learning how to speak, my voice was repeated back to me, imperfect, curious, wrong. And in one chilling instant, I realized it wasn't mimicking me anymore. It was testing. Moisture slicked the floor, turning stone into a mirror. My reflection wavered with each step, fractured into shards by rippling water. I saw myself multiplied, scattered into versions that stared up with accusing eyes. I knelt, dipping my fingers into the puddle, only to recoil at its warmth. Subterranean water should be icy, but this felt like blood coursing through veins. For a fleeting second, I thought I felt it pulse. My mind reached for science like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Caves create infrasound, tones too low for human ears but powerful enough to stir unease. Studies suggest infrasound can make people see shadows, hear whispers, feel dread without cause. It explained so much, but not everything. Not the way the whispers knew my name, not the warmth of the water, not the voice that suddenly broke the pattern. You're late. The words were unmistakable. They carried not as an echo, but as a statement, disembodied and waiting. My knees buckled, palms flat against the damp limestone. I had no answer, no rational hook to hang those words upon. My flashlight dimmed, its beam flickering like a dying heartbeat. Each stutter of light revealed more than I wanted to see. Impressions of hands pressed into stone, outlines of faces carved by shadow, all vanishing the moment I blinked. The silence that followed was worse than the voice itself. It wasn't absence, but presence, thick and suffocating. I felt as though the cave was holding its breath, anticipating mine. When I finally found the courage to speak, I whispered into the void, asking the only question my trembling mind could form. The reply came instantly, a rush of whispers from every angle, overlapping, crashing like waves. Not a single voice, but hundreds, maybe thousands, carrying words I couldn't understand. I staggered backward, retreating toward the main passage. My light steadied only when I reached the wider chamber, its ceiling rising like the mouth of salvation. My chest burned, lungs desperate for air that didn't feel stolen. But even in that relative safety, one sound followed me. A faint, deliberate repetition of my own footsteps, echoing half a beat behind. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't left sanctuary and prison. Perched high above Yosemite, its wooden frame groans against the wind, and the windows serve as my eyes across endless acres of pine and granite. My duty is simple in theory. Scan the horizon for smoke. Spot the faintest thread before it grows into a catastrophe. Night after night, I've watched the valley breathe beneath me, the trees swaying like a green ocean under the moon. There's comfort in the routine, a rhythm as steady as the tick of my pocket watch. But routine is fragile, and the valley has ways of shattering it. That evening, the sky was unusually clear, stars pricked into velvet like scattered glass. My binoculars swept the ridges out of habit, tracing familiar landmarks. Then I saw it, the glow. At first I thought it was flame, the kind that makes the stomach drop and the pulse spike. But this wasn't fire. It pulsed, steady and rhythmic, as though the earth itself had grown a heart. It throbbed deep in the valley, spilling a red hue that stained the rocks like fresh blood. I blinked, wiped my lenses, convinced it was a trick of tired eyes. Yet when I looked again, it was stronger, brighter, almost alive. My fingers tightened around the binoculars, knuckles aching. Training dictated I call it in immediately, but something about the glow rooted me to silence. There was a wrongness to it. No smoke rising, no crackle of flame, just a radiance that seemed to breathe in and out. I had the unsettling impression that if I listened hard enough, I'd hear it beat. Then I saw the figure. Through the magnification, it stood against the glow like a shadow cut out of bone. Too tall, its limbs impossibly thin, its posture frozen in unnatural stillness. At first, I thought it was a tree, one of the countless sentinels etched against the horizon. But the longer I stared, the more I realized the trees around it swayed in the wind while this thing remained rigid, defiant. My scalp prickled with electricity, the kind of awareness you feel when you're being watched. I whispered a curse under my breath and tore my eyes away, hoping the vision would dissolve when I looked back. It didn't. If anything, the glow pulsed brighter, wrapping that figure in a halo of red like molten metal. My throat tightened. Was it moving closer? I couldn't be sure. The shadows played tricks, elongating, shrinking, reshaping. My radio sat heavy in my lap, the button waiting for my call. But I didn't press it. Some primal instinct warned me that naming what I saw would give it power. Minutes stretched into hours, my gaze fixed, my breath shallow. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the glow died. The valley fell into darkness so complete it felt unnatural. A curtain yanked, down mid-performance. I scanned desperately, but the figure was gone, swallowed whole by shadow. No embers, no smoke, not a trace of heat. The land lay black and untouched, as though nothing had ever burned. And in that silence, I wondered, had I truly seen it, or had something in the valley allowed me to? By dawn, I convinced myself it had been an illusion, the byproduct of fatigue, and imagination stretched thin by isolation. I logged it in the incident report as protocol demanded. Unverified glow, possible atmospheric refraction. My pen shook as I wrote the words, reducing the impossible to sterile ink. The report would vanish into filing cabinets, buried under stacks of weather data and trail closures. False alarm. That phrase would erase the night. Yet deep in my chest I knew what I saw was neither mistake nor mirage. It had been a message, and the message had been meant for me. The forest looked ordinary when sunlight spilled over the peaks. Pines glistened with dew, squirrels darted between branches, and the granite cliffs reflected back a cold, honest brilliance. Nothing remained of the pulsing glow, not even a scorch mark. But when I lifted my binoculars again, my stomach lurched. In the place where the figure had stood, The trees leaned away unnaturally, their crowns bent as if pushed aside by something that wasn't there. Nature bends under wind, weight, or storm. But this bending was different. Angled, deliberate, as though the forest had been asked to make room. I tried to focus on routine, logging wind speeds, cloud cover, humidity levels, but every detail seemed staged, like a backdrop in a theater. The silence of the valley was too precise, too rehearsed. Even the birdsong faltered, coming in short, hesitant bursts. It was as if the park itself knew what had stirred overnight and was holding its breath, waiting to see if it would return. That evening, fatigue pressed down on me, but sleep wouldn't come. I sat by the window, coffee cooling untouched in its enamel mug. The tower creaked with the rhythm of old bones, timbers straining against the night air. I stared into the valley, every nerve tuned to the possibility of that glow. When it came, it didn't blaze like before. It flickered faintly, a heartbeat skipping beats, dim but insistent. Against my better judgment, I raised the binoculars again. The figure was there, closer this time, no longer blurred by distance. My chest constricted, lungs refusing air. It was not a man, not in any human sense. Its proportions were wrong, arms too long, head tilted as if unhinged, legs rooted yet unbalanced. It didn't move, but I felt movement in my bones, a vibration traveling up the tower itself. The glow wrapped around it like skin made of firelight, pulsing in rhythm with my own racing pulse. I wanted to call it in, to demand backup, to have someone else witness what I could barely comprehend. But fear clamped my throat shut. Some truths can't be shared without consequence. I lowered the binoculars, and when I dared to look again with naked eyes, the valley was empty. Black, silent, innocent. When I filed my final report that week, I wrote exactly what they wanted. No fire observed. But the words betrayed me. Because fire reveals what should be hidden, yet it also disguises what stands behind it. And in the quiet hours, when the valley pulses faintly in memory, I can't shake the certainty that I was never watching it. That Jenny Lake has moods, the way a person does. Some mornings it glitters with clarity, glassy and pristine, and others it darkens, sulking under a gray sky. For years I dismissed that kind of talk as folklore, a way for people to romanticize nature. Water is chemistry, I told myself. A system of balance between oxygen, carbon, and sediment. A mirror for the mountains above it. Nothing more. But one dawn changed the way I looked at that lake forever. The morning began with silence so deep it pressed against my ears. Normally the birds erupted first, their songs carrying across the valley like strings tuning before a symphony. But that day the forest was mute. Mist clung to the water, thick enough to blur the horizon, and the air felt damp in a way that seeped into bone. I remember thinking the lake looked like a lung under an X-ray, pale veils shifting with each invisible breath. And then I saw it move. At first it was subtle, a swell rising across the surface, not from wind or current, but from something beneath. The water expanded upward, lifting as though inhaling, the fog swirling tighter until it resembled veins lit faintly under skin. Then, with an eerie patience, the surface sank again, exhaling in a slow collapse. My heart skipped. Lakes don't breathe, they ripple, they churn, but they do not rise and fall like a chest filled with air. I reached for science, clinging to the rational like a rope. Limnology, the study of inland waters, tells us that stratification layers oxygen, that temperature shifts can cause the water to turn over, cycling nutrients and gases. Sometimes fish suffocate when oxygen is depleted. That thought snapped into focus when I noticed them. Silver bellies breaking the surface, dead trout bobbing like discarded coins. Their eyes were dull, their bodies eerily still, as if they had died mid-swim. Yet even as I forced logic into place, doubt clawed through me. I'd studied turnovers before, and they weren't like this. A turnover was chaotic, mixing waters violently. This was rhythmic, deliberate, like a heartbeat pounding beneath the lake bed. My skin prickled as I realized I was watching not chaos, but intention. Something was orchestrating the water's rise and fall. The fog thickened, curling in tendrils that slithered across the shallows. It didn't drift aimlessly like mist should. It coiled with purpose, twining into shapes that seemed to trace invisible lines. I stepped closer, boots sinking into damp soil, and that's when the ripples appeared. They spread across the surface in delicate arcs, colliding, merging, reforming until they arranged into letters. My name. It was written there, trembling in watery script, the surface trembling as though the lake itself whispered me into existence. I stumbled back, heart hammering against ribs, unable to process the sight. Water can reflect, distort, even mimic. But to spell, to summon identity? No textbook explained this. The dead fish shifted, circling toward the letters as if answering a silent command. Their bodies floated together in eerie choreography, an orbit forming around the name etched across the water. The lake hadn't just breathed, it had spoken, and I realized with a jolt of terror, some lakes don't remember who visits them. They choose who they call back. I couldn't look away. The name dissolved slowly, the ripples flattening into glassy calm as though the lake had swallowed its own words. But the silence that followed was heavier than before, as if something waited beneath, patient and hungry. My rational mind clawed for footholds, thermal shifts, oxygen flux, the simple cruelty of coincidence. Yet the air tasted metallic, a tang of iron that didn't belong on a mountain morning. My breath fogged in the mist, and for one terrifying instant, I felt the inhale wasn't mine. I forced myself to kneel by the water's edge, dipping a hand into the shallows. The surface was warmer than it should have been, tepid like blood cooled on skin. My fingers trembled as they broke the surface, and I swore I felt resistance, a subtle pushback, as though the lake didn't want me touching it. Beneath, the water seemed to shudder with a pulse. My heart stuttered in response, caught in an uncanny rhythm that wasn't my own. I thought of the fish, dozens of them suspended belly up like offerings. Their stillness unsettled me, but their arrangement was worse. They were clustering, aligning into arcs, then spirals, like magnets arranging iron filings into order. Dead bodies shouldn't move, yet here they were, carried by invisible currents that circled one another like ritual. And at the center of their orbit, the water swelled again, rising into that slow, deliberate breath. I whispered aloud that it was impossible, that I was misinterpreting a natural phenomenon, but my voice sounded weak against the vast hush of the lake. A bird shrieked from somewhere in the tree line, sharp enough to break the spell, and I turned instinctively toward the sound. When I looked back, the spirals had tightened, and for a fleeting instant, the dead fish formed the shape of a face. It was crude, distorted by scales and fins, but unmistakably human. Hollow sockets stared up from the water, lips formed of pale bellies parted as though gasping. The image lasted only seconds before breaking apart, scattering like ash across ripples. I reeled backward, my boots skidding on the slick shore. Science insists water holds no memory beyond minerals, sediments, and chemical imprints, but I'd just seen memory rendered in shape, in breath, in invocation. Some part of me wanted to call it a trick of the mind. Pareidolia, the brain's need to find faces in randomness. Yet I couldn't dismiss the cold certainty that the lake hadn't just shown me a face. It had shown me recognition. The fog thinned as the first rays of sun stretched across the valley, painting the water gold. For anyone else, Jenny Lake would look harmless, serene even, as if nothing had happened. But my body still carried the imprint of that other rhythm, a phantom heartbeat thrumming through bone. I knew then that the ranger's jokes weren't just folklore. Jenny Lake wasn't alive in the way we imagine, but it was aware. And awareness is more dangerous than life itself, because if a lake can breathe, it can also hunger, and hunger always returns. They gave shape to the wilderness, transforming chaos into order, paths into promises. As a ranger, I trusted the thin black lines and dotted contours more than my own memory. But one late afternoon, while checking an old trailhead deep in the park, I discovered something that reminded me how fragile that trust really was. The path was overgrown, pine needles thick underfoot, branches clawing across my jacket. According to the map, it should have opened into nothing more than an abandoned clearing, long forgotten by hikers. Yet when I broke through the last line of trees, the air shifted. The smell hit me first. Campfire smoke laced with pine tar, sharp and fresh, as though someone had just fed kindling to flames. My boots sank into soft earth, still warm in patches. In the clearing stood tents, half collapsed and sagging, nylon walls shivering in the breeze. A lantern flickered on its side, its flame sputtering but alive. The strangest detail, though, was the coffee. Tin mugs perched on tree stumps, steam spiraling upward in delicate curls. Whoever had brewed them couldn't have been gone more than a few minutes. And yet the place was silent. The kind of silence that presses into your skin until you feel like you're trespassing in your own reality. I called out, my voice bouncing back too fast, as if the trees themselves had no patience. For echoes, no response. I checked the tents, sleeping bags unzipped, flashlights tossed carelessly on the ground, boots lined neatly at entrances. Everything suggested normalcy, the routine clutter of campers. But there were no people. Not a single track leaving the clearing, not a snapped branch, not a scatter of belongings that suggested panic. It was as though they had evaporated mid-breath, leaving the scene staged in eerie perfection. I forced myself to catalog details, clinging to procedure the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. Time of discovery, approximate temperature of the coffee, wind direction, number of tents. But the list unraveled when I noticed a detail that didn't fit. One of the mugs quivered, as if nudged by unseen hands. My pulse spiked. The surface of the liquid rippled outward in concentric circles, slow and deliberate, as though something beneath the earth had stirred. The forest felt closer now, leaning inward, its canopy forming a cage of shadow. I couldn't shake the sensation that the clearing itself was watching me, waiting for me to realize I didn't belong. My radio hissed faint static at my side, and for one wild second I expected to hear voices, the missing campers calling back from wherever they had gone. But only static answered, crackling like brittle leaves. I backed away step by step, heart pounding loud enough to drown out thought. When I reached the tree line, I turned once more to the clearing. The steam still curled from the mugs, thin as smoke signals. It felt like a message, though I couldn't decipher if it was warning or invitation. And with every instinct screaming at me, I realized something I couldn't admit out loud. Maps may not lie, but sometimes the land itself does. Part 2I returned. The next morning with 2 colleagues, convinced that what I'd seen could be explained by fatigue, faulty perception, or some elaborate prank. I braced myself for their laughter when they'd find the tents just as I had left them. Coffee cooling, lanterns still sputtering, evidence that people had simply walked off in haste. But when we reached the trailhead, the forest greeted us. With only stillness, the clearing was gone. Where I remembered tents, there was now only a dense wall of pine and undergrowth, thick enough to suggest no human hand had disturbed it for decades. The ground bore no impressions of stakes or boots. The stumps where mugs had once sat were missing, their wood rotted into earth long before my time. My colleagues studied the map, then glanced at me with raised brows, as though I had confused one trail for another. But I knew every bend, every contour. This was the place. I stepped forward, searching for any trace. A torn zipper, a patch of soot, the faintest indentation in soil. Nothing. The earth was unbroken, undisturbed, as if the previous night had been a dream I hadn't yet woken from. Still, beneath the silence, I sensed an undercurrent. The air tasted sharp, metallic, like the moments before a storm. A crow barked overhead, its call fractured, too loud for the emptiness it pierced. My colleagues shrugged it off, muttering about long hours and hallucinations. But I saw something shift in their eyes, the same doubt clawing through me. When they left, I lingered. I pressed my palm to the bark of a nearby tree, its surface rough and unyielding. Yet behind that solidity, I felt something deeper, like a thrum. The forest wasn't empty. It was closed, like a wound that had sutured itself overnight. The clearing had been erased, not by time, but by intention. I pulled out my notebook, the one where I logged patrols and strange sightings. I wrote quickly, documenting every detail from memory, my handwriting jagged. But when I looked down minutes later, the ink had smudged. Whole sentences had blurred into illegible streaks, as though moisture had seeped through the pages. My fingers tingled, numb at the tips. I shoved the notebook back into my pack, uneasy at how the forest seemed determined to erase even my recollection. As I made my way back down the trail, I couldn't shake the sensation of being followed. Not in the obvious way. No snapping twigs, no heavy footsteps, but something subtler, a pressure at my back. The hair on my arms prickled. Once, I turned abruptly, catching sight of movement between the trees. It wasn't human. Too fluid, too seamless. A ripple in the canopy like breath, passing through lungs. When I blinked, the trees stood still, but the feeling lingered. That night, lying in my bunk, the smell of pine tar clung to me, though I had washed and scrubbed. My mind replayed the image of those steaming mugs, that final ripple across their surfaces. It wasn't abandonment, it wasn't accident. The campers had been taken or welcomed into something I couldn't name, and as sleep pulled me under, one thought kept echoing. The forest doesn't lose people. Night has a sound all its own. The wind threads through the pines in long, hollow sighs, carrying whispers that seem almost human. I'd grown used to it over years of patrols, treating the noise as background music, branches bending, needles clashing, trunks creaking under pressure. But one night, the forest decided to change its tune. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that stings your lungs with every inhale. My flashlight beam carved narrow corridors through the darkness, catching glimmers of frost on needles that looked like tiny shards of glass. My boots crunched over damp soil, and with each step I told myself I was chasing routine. Check the trails, confirm no campers had strayed past curfew, record the stillness, nothing more. Yet deep in the pines, the forest held an energy that set my teeth on edge. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, blending so seamlessly with the wind I thought I imagined it. A sound like children giggling. My pulse stumbled. I stopped walking, letting silence pool around me. The giggling came again, higher, sharper, and unmistakable. It darted between the trees like a mischievous echo, impossible to pin down. My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed, the way you feel when shadows move faster than your eyes. I scanned the area, forcing rational explanations into my brain. Sound can bend in forests, caught and thrown by trunks like ricocheting bullets. Pines, with their dense spacing, create pockets where wind transforms into strange acoustics. But laughter carried warmth, human breath, innocence. And this laughter felt anything but innocent. I lifted my recorder from my pack, pressing it on out of habit. If the sound was real, I'd capture it. Proof to analyze later. Proof that my ears weren't betraying me. For several minutes, the woods hummed with nothing but wind and the delicate brushing of needles. They sounded like skeletal fingers, dry and patient, combing through one another as if restless. I began to believe I'd hallucinated it, the way fatigue can invent noises from silence. But then the giggling returned, louder this time, rising from behind me. I spun with the flashlight, beam slicing across endless ranks of trunks. Nothing. Yet the laughter carried, layered now, more voices piling into a chorus. And beneath the high, playful notes lurked something else. An undertone, low and almost guttural, like the earth itself trying to join in. My chest tightened. I pushed deeper, against my better judgment. The forest seemed to open just ahead, a faint glow bleeding through the trees. Relief surged. Maybe campers had lit a lantern. Maybe this had an ordinary explanation. But when I checked the recorder moments later, my stomach turned. What I had heard as laughter played back differently. The voices were there, yes, but twisted, warped into words that shouldn't have been possible. Don't follow the light. The phrase hissed through the speaker in overlapping tones, Neither child nor adult, but something caught between. My hand trembled. Ahead, my flashlight flickered once, twice, and in that faltering glow, the deeper light moved, a pale lantern drifting through the pines, carried by no hand I could see. The glow drifted deeper into the forest, weaving slowly, between the trunks like a lure cast into dark water. My flashlight sputtered in protest, its beam paling against the strange light as though it knew it couldn't compete. I tightened my grip on the recorder, its weight suddenly useless, a fragile talisman against something I couldn't name. Each step forward felt involuntary, drawn by equal parts dread and compulsion. The pines whispered louder now, their needles rasping against one another like bones grinding in their sockets. The sound formed patterns, almost rhythms, as if the forest itself was breathing in hushed syllables. I told myself it was just wind, just physics. Air funnels through narrow gaps, creating harmonics that mimic speech. I'd read about it, even lectured visitors about it. But no textbook could explain the deliberate cadence, the way certain phrases seemed to rise and repeat. My name among them. I froze, heart slamming against ribs. The forest shouldn't know, me. Yet in the thrum of branches, I swore I heard it again. My name stretched thin, pulled apart, then reassembled in a whisper so close it felt spoken directly into my ear. My flashlight guttered, plunging the woods into near blackness. Only the drifting glow remained, steady and patient, beckoning me to follow. The warning from the recorder replayed in my mind. Don't follow the light. My rational side clawed at the words, desperate to obey, but something deeper inside me wanted to know what waited in that radiance. Curiosity can be a predator, its teeth disguised as questions. I took a step forward, the soil damp and soft beneath my boots, carrying the scent of resin and decay. The glow shifted, and for the first time I glimpsed its shape. It wasn't lantern light. It pulsed, organic, like the phosphorescent glow of deep-sea creatures that lure prey in the abyss. Its edges weren't defined. Instead, they bled into the mist, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. My chest tightened in response, my own pulse sinking involuntarily. Then, just as suddenly, the laughter returned. Not behind me this time, but ahead, rising from within the light itself. The giggles warped, twisting higher until they broke apart, into something shrill, something closer to screams. My instincts flared like alarms. I turned, fumbling with my flashlight, desperate to retreat. That was when the trees moved. It wasn't the swaying of branches, it was the trunks themselves, leaning, closing in, their shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. The whispering needles crescendoed into a cacophony. No longer wind, but layered voices crowding my ears, all repeating the same warning in different tones. Don't follow the light. Don't follow the light. I stumbled back toward the trail, lungs burning, every nerve alight with panic. My flashlight caught brief flashes of faces etched in bark, mouths open mid-scream, eyes hollowed into darkness. And still the glow followed, weaving closer, patient as a predator stalking wounded prey. When I finally broke free onto the main path, the forest went silent. The glow extinguished like a flame pinched between fingers. My recorder, clutched tight, in my hand, buzzed with static. Through it, one last phrase slipped, soft and deliberate. More than a wooden shack, weather-beaten and slouched against the elements, tucked away in a corner of Glacier National Park that rarely saw human boots anymore. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, its windows clouded with dust, as though time had deliberately forgotten it. I pushed the door open and felt the hinges resist, groaning like a throat reluctant to speak. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the musk of mildew and abandoned paper. And there, on the desk, was the journal. It was leather-bound, edges curled, its cover etched with cracks like a map of dried rivers. I brushed snowmelt from its surface and opened it, expecting routine notes, weather patterns, animal sightings, maybe a list of supply shortages. Instead, I found a voice. The entries began with precision, detailing snowfall depths and trail conditions, the steady handwriting of a ranger trained to measure the wilderness by numbers. Yet, as the pages turned, the tone shifted. The words grew erratic, the margins crowded with scribbles. Descriptions of creaking ice, of strange vibrations in the ground, of nights spent unable to sleep because the glacier itself seemed to move with intent. The final entry stopped abruptly in 1979. I read the last line 3 times, each word sinking, like a stone through my chest. It waits under the ice. I closed the book, but the phrase clung to me. Outside, the glacier stretched endlessly. A frozen leviathan sprawled across the land. Science tells us glaciers move slowly, inches per year, carving valleys over millennia. They are monuments to patience, to geological time beyond human comprehension. Yet that evening, as I stepped back into the biting cold, I heard it groan. The sound was nothing like the delicate crack of ice I'd grown accustomed to. This was deeper, heavier, like thunder rolling through bone. The ground trembled under my boots, subtle but unmistakable, and I felt as though the earth itself had taken a breath. I stared out across the ice, and for the first time in my career, the glacier did not seem lifeless. It seemed restless. The sky dimmed into dusk, streaked with the bruised colors of an unsettled storm. I lingered at the edge of the ice field, unable to shake the words from the journal. It waits under the ice. What could he have meant? An animal trapped in the crevasses? A metaphor for the power of nature, biding its time? Or something else? Something the ranger had seen or heard that pushed him to abandon logic in his final note. My radio hissed with static, a reminder of how alone I was out here. No voices on the other end, just the endless crackle like ice splintering beneath weight. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest rumble, not from above, but from beneath. My skin prickled. Glaciers preserve. They entomb mammoths, pollen, entire landscapes coded like forgotten maps. But preservation cuts both ways. If a glacier can hold life in perfect stasis, what else can it hold? Unmoving, patient, until the world finally shifts enough to let it out. The ice groaned again, longer this time, and the sound was almost articulate, like something stirring in its sleep. Part 2. That night I couldn't bring myself to leave the outpost. The journal sat on the desk where I had left it, its final words etched into my mind as if branded there. It waits under the ice. I tried to convince myself that exhaustion was making me dramatic, that my imagination had dressed up natural sounds in supernatural clothing. But each time the glacier groaned, the shack quivered slightly, the lantern on the table shuddering in rhythm. It didn't sound random. It sounded deliberate, like a knock coming from beneath floorboards. I pulled on my parka and stepped back outside, my breath pluming white in the freezing air. The night sky was clear, stars sharp as glass scattered across black velvet. But all I could hear was the ice. It stretched in front of me, gleaming under starlight, cracked with fissures that spidered outward like veins. I walked closer, boots crunching over snow crust, and stopped at the edge of a deep fracture. The air rising from it was warmer than it should have been, damp, almost fetid, as though something alive exhaled from below. I leaned in, listening. The sound that met me wasn't the snap of shifting ice. It was a low vibration, steady, pulsing, through the glacier like the heartbeat of something immense. My chest tightened, my pulse sinking with it against my will. For a moment I thought I heard more, a resonance that carried fragments of shape, almost like syllables struggling to form words. I staggered back, spine stiff with the realization that I was no longer imagining intention. I was hearing it. The journal's earlier entries resurfaced in my mind, the ranger's gradual unraveling. He had tried to record the patterns too, marking dates, times, frequencies, until his notations turned frantic, erratic, like a man trying to measure a storm with bare hands. And then he stopped. The silence in the pages after 1979 was louder than any sound. The glacier moaned again, longer this time, and deep beneath the ice, something shifted. A slab fractured with a noise like gunfire, echoing across the valley. I stumbled backward as a jagged line opened at my feet, the snow collapsing into darkness. Steam poured upward, curling into the night like the smoke of some hidden furnace. I caught the sharp stench of sulfur, unexpected and raw, stabbing into my throat. Geologists say glaciers conceal volcanic heat, pockets of geothermal activity that bubble and flex unseen. But standing there, I felt none of the detached wonder of science. I felt dread, because the sound that followed wasn't geological. It was a groan, stretched low and impossibly vast, like a body stirring after decades of sleep. I turned and fled, snow spraying beneath my boots, the outpost lantern swinging wildly in the distance. Behind me, the ice heaved again, a soundless swell visible even in the dark. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Back inside, the journal lay open, though I had left it closed. A new line had appeared, scrawled in handwriting not my own, smeared and wet as though the ink had only just bled. A silence that feels sacred. It isn't the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but a vast, dense stillness that presses in on you, swallowing every stray sound. No roads, no engines, no electricity humming faintly in the background, just endless snowfields and mountains that breathe with their own rhythm. At first, that silence comforts you. It's like being submerged underwater, floating in a weightless cocoon. But after weeks alone on patrol, the same silence sharpens into something else, a mirror that forces you to listen to your own heartbeat too closely. I'd been stationed out there with a set of instruments designed to track seismic shifts and wind patterns. On most nights, they recorded nothing but background hums, the steady language of the earth. But one midnight, the data changed. The line on the graph trembled with waves too slow for ears to catch, registering frequencies beneath 20 hertz. Infrasound. I'd read about it in journals, how it has a way of bypassing the ears and speaking directly to the body. You don't hear it. You feel it. And when it struck me, I knew. It started in my ribs. They vibrated subtly, like struck tuning, forks resonating against bone. Then came the ache in my jaw, my teeth grinding in discomfort as if some unseen pressure pushed against the enamel. Nausea followed, creeping up with no cause. Every hair on my arm stood stiff, antennae for a signal my mind couldn't interpret. Some researchers claim infrasound explains hauntings, that the unease, the shadow at the edge of vision, the dread without source, all stem from vibrations in that range. But what science can't explain is intent. Because as the low frequency pulsed through the stillness, I realized it wasn't random, it was patterned, like footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling my tent. Each vibration landed in my chest, pacing slowly around me. The rhythm was steady, almost taunting, as though whatever carried it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. My hands trembled as I unzipped the flap, expecting to see some animal nosing through the snow. But the world outside was empty. Nothing moved. The snow lay unbroken, pristine, glowing faintly under the fractured light of the moon. I stood barefoot in the cold, waiting. The air didn't stir, not even the faintest breath of wind. Yet still, I felt it. The pressure of footsteps I couldn't hear, only absorbed through bone. They circled, closer now, as if drawing me into some boundary I hadn't meant to cross. My skin burned with cold, but deeper still, my chest ached with resonance. Each thud felt like a fist pressed against my sternum, demanding acknowledgement. Logic urged me back inside. I crawled into my sleeping bag, heart pounding so loud it seemed another rhythm joined the vibrations outside. I switched on the recorder, hoping to capture proof, a thread of data I could analyze in daylight. The graph spiked again, tracing a curve too perfect to be chance. My pulse quickened as I realized it wasn't just vibration, it was communication. And beneath the weight of that holy silence, I began to wonder who or what was trying to speak through it. Sleep never came. I lay awake, ribs humming like wires under strain, every shallow breath vibrating in tune with that low, impossible frequency. The silence of Denali had been sacred once, but now it felt profaned, like a cathedral overtaken by something that wasn't worship, but intrusion. My recorder ticked faintly beside me, its needle trembling across the graph, capturing waves of sound that should not exist. I kept staring at it, hoping the lines would flatten, but they only grew sharper, steadier, as if whatever was moving outside had settled into rhythm. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled on my boots, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the cold. The snow reflected the moonlight like powdered glass, stretching in every direction. No tracks marred its surface, no animal stirred, yet the pressure against my chest intensified. It felt as though the ground itself was alive, reverberating with unseen weight. The vibrations clustered now, moving in closer arcs, pacing me, drawing, a circle that tightened with every invisible step. I told myself it was geophysics. Glaciers shift, ice compresses and groans. The land breathes in ways we barely understand. But deep down, I knew glaciers don't pace in circles. Glaciers don't mimic footsteps. And glaciers don't stop moving when you stop breathing. Because, when I held my breath, the vibrations paused. Perfectly. The realization froze me more than the wind ever could. Something was listening. Not just broadcasting pressure, but responding to me, measuring me. Slowly, I exhaled, and the vibrations resumed, echoing my pulse in perfect synchrony. I wasn't experiencing an accident of physics. I was locked in a dialogue I hadn't agreed to. I pressed my gloved hand against the snow. It trembled beneath my palm, faint but deliberate. Not random shudders of ice, but a cadence. 3 pulses. Pause. 2 more. Pause. Repeated like a code. The snow seemed to breathe with it, exhaling frost that swirled briefly before vanishing. My scientific mind scrambled to parse it, to match it to seismic activity, to natural cycles, but the rhythm was too intentional. It felt less like geology and more like a knock on the door of the human body. And then came the sound I could hear, not through instruments, not through vibration, but through air. A faint crunch, the unmistakable weight of something stepping across snow. My flashlight shook in my hand as I raised it, beam slicing through the trees. Nothing reflected back, but pines standing stiff as grave markers. Yet the crunch repeated, closer this time, circling. My recorder inside the tent whined, its needle straining off the chart. I wanted to run, but the snow around me was untouched. If I fled, I knew I wouldn't leave footprints either. Whatever walked there wasn't bound by surface or weight. Turned slowly in place, chest pounding, whispering into the dark as if my words could anchor me. "Who are you?" The silence answered, heavier than before. Then, in one deep vibration that rattled my bones and blurred my vision, the ground spoke. Back, not in language, but in intention, and the message was clear. You heard us now, the redwoods that no other forest carries. Walking among them feels like entering a cathedral whose walls are alive, pillars of bark stretching skyward, ancient and unyielding. Their silence isn't empty, it's reverent, as if the trees themselves are guarding something older than memory. I had patrolled these groves dozens of times, and each time I found myself staring upward until my neck ached, humbled by their immensity. But on one night, under a thin wash of moonlight, that reverence shifted into unease. At first, it was the carvings. The patterns seemed etched into the bark far above my head, spirals and lines woven into strange geometries. No human hand could have reached that high without scaffolding, yet the grooves were deliberate, cut clean into the living wood. The designs coiled upward, vanishing into the canopy like messages coded into a ladder no one could climb. My flashlight beam caught on them, and for a fleeting instant they glowed faintly, as if the trees had absorbed the light and decided to give some back. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Trees scar easily. Lightning can burn streaks into bark. Insects carve galleries beneath the surface. Still, my skin prickled. This was no accident of weather or biology. The spirals weren't random. They were arranged like language, as though the forest had written something it expected me to read. I pressed my palm against the grooves, half expecting to feel the wood warm beneath my hand. Instead, the bark was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of resin. Yet standing there, I couldn't shake the impression of being watched. The trees seemed to lean, their trunks subtly angling inward, their crowns knitting tighter to conceal the sky. I heard the faint rustle of branches shifting against one another, not with wind, but with intent. Science offered me a rope to cling to. Botanists have long studied how trees communicate underground, their roots bound in a hidden network of fungi, trading nutrients and sending signals like neurons in a forest-wide brain. Warning messages travel this way. When one tree is wounded, others prepare for threat. But what if the network didn't just warn? What if it remembered? What if, over centuries, the trees had gathered every name, every secret, every trespass, carved into their bark and fed it back into their roots until it grew into something sentient? I shook the thought away and continued down the path, though every step felt heavier. The moonlight caught more carvings as I walked, the symbols multiplying, twisting into shapes I almost recognized. A face, a hand, or perhaps the suggestion of letters. My light flickered, and in the instant of darkness, the spirals seemed to deepen, their edges sharper when the beam returned. The night pressed closer, the grove swallowing even the faintest sounds. My own breath echoed too loud in my ears, and I realized the trees had quieted everything else, the crickets, the owls, even the distant rush of the river. The redwoods weren't just standing, they were listening, and as I turned back for one last glance, I saw it clearly, illuminated where no light should have reached, the beginning of my name, carved deep into living bark 20 feet above my head. I stood frozen, my breath visible in the thin moonlight, staring at the impossible letters carved into living wood. The grooves were fresh, sharp-edged, sap glistening like blood beneath the bark. My name. No prankster could have scaled that height in silence, and no tool could have cut so cleanly without leaving shavings or scars at the base. It felt less like vandalism and more like revelation, like the forest had reached down into memory and decided to write me into its skin. Sleep was out of the question. I camped uneasily at the grove's edge, firelight flickering against bark that now seemed too close, too aware. Every pop of the flame sounded swallowed, muted by the towering trees. They loomed like witnesses, their shadows stretching long and skeletal across the forest floor. I opened my notebook, intending to capture the details while they were still, sharp, but my hand shook. What could I even write? The forest knows my name. It sounded insane even to me. Yet when I returned at dawn, the truth deepened. The spirals had spread. Entire trunks were scored with patterns I hadn't seen the night before, rising higher, glowing faintly where the morning sun kissed their bark. And worse, my name was no longer alone. More letters joined it, sentences forming, though in no language I knew. They wound upward in strange symmetry, looping in ways that reminded me of circuits or veins. I felt dizzy staring at them, as if my brain was struggling to decode something it wasn't built to understand. I pressed my ear to the bark, half in defiance, half in desperation, and I swear I heard something. Not the creak of wood or the flow of sap, but a low murmur, countless threads of sound braided together like whispers passing through hollow bone. It was communication, too layered for me to parse. A pulse throbbed faintly in the trunk, a rhythm like a heartbeat buried deep inside centuries of growth. Science says redwoods talk underground, their roots linked in networks of fungi and exchange, like neurons firing in a brain that spans acres. But standing there, I felt certain this was no metaphor. This grove was alive in ways we hadn't dared to name. If trees could share warnings, why not memories? Why not identity? By dusk, the carvings had shifted again. I watched them change. In real time, the grooves deepening as though invisible hands etched them with blades of air. My name stretched higher, curling into the spirals until it vanished beyond sight. My skin crawled. It wasn't just recording me. It was absorbing me, writing me into the architecture of the forest itself. The wind rose suddenly, a sharp hiss through the needles, and the sound carried shape. Not random rustling, but syllables. A word, faint but distinct, threading through the grove like breath across stone. Stay. The trees had spoken, and for the first time in my life, I realized the danger wasn't in being forgotten by the forest.
The end of a shift
It was
always
in being
feels
like
remembered.
slipping out of a heavy coat. Your body loosens, your thoughts already drifting toward rest. That night, I had just logged my final notes when the radio crackled. At first, it was nothing unusual, just the restless hiss of static. But then a voice broke through, urgent, ragged, strained by fear. It begged for help. The words came fragmented, but the desperation in them was clear enough. I straightened, fatigue burning off me like fog under sun. Protocol drilled into me. Always respond. I pressed the transmitter, asked for coordinates, and what came back was a string of numbers, rattled off in haste. I scribbled them down, my hand unsteady. Something in the tone didn't match a hiker's panic. It was too hollow, too rehearsed. But adrenaline has a way of drowning out doubt. I grabbed my pack, clipped on my headlamp, and started out. The trail was empty, the air cold enough to sting my lungs. Owls called in the distance, but even their voices sounded muted, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed the map, heart pounding faster with every step, until I reached the coordinates. That's when the truth hit me, like a hammer. The spot they led to wasn't a campsite. It wasn't even accessible terrain. The numbers landed dead in the center of a canyon, sheer stone walls plunging into black nothingness. No trails led down. No human could have been there. I stood on the rim, my breath clouding in pale bursts, staring into the abyss. The silence was suffocating. Then the radio screamed. The static roared alive, nearly tearing the device from my grip. Voices bled through it. Multiple voices, overlapping, shrill with terror. I could make out screaming, frantic cries twisted by distortion, but underneath it all, there was another layer. My own voice. I froze, the sound hollowing me out from the inside. It was me, unmistakably woven into the chaos, shouting words I couldn't quite decipher. My throat tightened, a primal terror rising that logic couldn't quell. I killed the power, thumb pressing hard against the switch. The crackling ceased. Relief poured through me like water into parched earth. But seconds later, the radio came back on by itself. The static whispered now, softer, almost gentle, like breath against glass. I held it at arm's length, heart jackhammering against my ribs, but the sound followed, pulling at me, coaxing me closer to the canyon's edge. The darkness below seemed to pulse in time with it, as though the canyon itself was exhaling, calling. The thought struck me, wild, irrational, but undeniable in that moment. The parks don't just witness us. They don't just stand silent as guardians of stone and trees. They remember, they hunger, and sometimes they call. The radio hissed again, and buried inside its static I heard my name, drawn out slowly, intimately, until it felt like the canyon itself was speaking. And then came the words that made my blood run cold. You're already here. Part 2. The words clung to me like frostbite, sharp and numbing. You're already here. My own voice carried back to me through static, layered and warped, as if it had been buried in the canyon long before I stood on its rim. My pulse hammered so hard my vision blurred. The ground beneath my boots felt thinner, like the rock itself had hollowed out, and I was balancing on skin stretched too tight over something beneath. I wanted to throw the radio into the dark, to sever the connection, but I couldn't. Some instinct told me it wouldn't matter. The sound wasn't bound to the device, it was bound to the place. Even as I held it, the static began to sync with me. Each hiss rose and fell in perfect rhythm with my breathing, my heartbeat, until I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. Stumbled back from the edge, but the canyon seemed to follow, shadows elongating toward me like spilled ink. The trees around me groaned in the night air, their trunks flexing as though trying to lean closer, to listen. Every fiber of my body screamed to run, to leave the coordinates behind and never speak of them again. But fear can be a leash, and curiosity is the hand that holds it. What if someone had been calling? What if the voice had been real? I lifted the radio again with trembling hands. The static cleared for a heartbeat, replaced by silence so deep it pressed into my skull. Then came the scream. It tore through the frequency, raw and human, so full of despair it shook me to the marrow. But underneath, tangled in the cry, was my own voice again. This time it was clearer. Help me. My knees weakened. I staggered, staring into the canyon, and for an instant, swore I saw movement far below, a pale flicker like firelight or perhaps lanterns swaying. Figures shifted in the glow, too far to define, but enough to make the void feel populated. Enough to make me doubt every law of reason I clung to. I snapped the radio off once more, holding my breath as if silence might banish the images. But the canyon had already answered. The glow winked out, swallowed by the black, leaving only my reflection in the void. A ranger peering into depths he had no right to measure. The land was never empty. It was waiting. When I finally turned away, the forest had changed. The trail behind me seemed less familiar, as if redrawn in the time I had stood staring. Branches curled inward like ribs, and the air thickened, heavy with pine resin and something sweeter, almost copper. I walked quickly, refusing to look back, yet the radio at my side pulsed faintly, light blinking though the power was off. Back at the station, I set it on the desk and stepped away, determined to never touch it again. But before dawn broke, the static rose one last time, filling the room with a whisper that was not a voice but a verdict. The parks don't just watch us, they call us home. Subscribe, if you dare.